Okay, folks, how we doing? We'll get started here in just a moment. And when we do get started, I think what I'd like to do is take a look at, there was a question at the end of chapter 5 that was due on the 15th that asked about coming up with ways of measuring things that are kind of squishy. This was, there's a couple questions. One was about something in the social sciences. Another question was about prejudice, I think it was. And so thought we would take some time to take a look at those questions and see what people came up with and see what people would like to share if something occurs to them as we go through this. But we will return to this again when we get into the SPSS portion of the class. We will be constructing our scales, using variables in the AdHealth data set. And this is an exercise in doing that. But we will get into this in much greater detail when we start doing the SPSS portion of this class, which will start not next week, but the week after. We'll start doing that. But that will, when we do that, we'll return to chapter 6, which we kind of skipped over because that deals with scales and indexes and the finite and the fine differences between the two and assessing reliability statistically and all those sorts of things. But what I'd like to do first off is that there was that question at the end of chapter 5, which was the chapter that was all about this stuff of how do you measure X? How is it conceptualized? How is it operationalized? And is what questions or what specifically would you be looking for as an indicator of whatever you're trying to measure? And so there was a question. The first question says pick a social science concept such as liberalism or alienation, then specify that concept so that it could be studied in a research project. Be sure to specify the indicators you'll use as well as the dimensions you wish to include in and exclude from your conceptualization. Okay, so there was that one, and then there was the other one that was number 3. It says to conceptualize the variable prejudice, use your favorite web browser to search for this term. After reviewing several of the websites resulting from your search, make a list of some different forms of prejudice that might be studied in an omnibus project dealing with that topic. An omnibus project is an overall global assessment of prejudice, I guess, and all the different ways one could measure it. And so, yeah, let's take a minute. I'm not sure how many of you respond to this officially on Moodle, but be a good way to get some participation points in how you would measure either one of the ones they were talking about in the first one, which basically could be anything in the social sciences, apparently. Just how would you specifically measure that? And then the other question was specifically about prejudice and how, because there's lots of different kinds of that, but how we would go about measuring that too, because that's also something that is looked at in the social sciences. Yeah, so just take a few minutes here, and I don't know, some of you I think posted about this on Moodle, and then you can say, but others, especially people who have not participated yet in this class, I'd ask that please jump in here and take a couple minutes here and see the ways that we've talked about measuring things in this class. So units of analysis, who would you be asking people? Would you be looking for internet searches for sexist or racist jokes? What would you be measuring, and how would you be measuring specifically? Questions from a survey. How would you be assessing something like prejudice or something else in the social sciences? They mentioned liberalism or alienation, but anything that you may, criminality or something like that. So yeah, just take a couple minutes and think about how we would put some indicators, some numbers to the indicators and measure these things. So see what you can do with that. And I'd be interested to hear from, especially some of you who have not yet participated, but whoever would be good. So.
I have number 1.
Okay, Mike. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and jump in, what did you do for number one?
Number one, I just used liberalism, like they gave in the example, but I said how one could look at how many students at a certain number of specified universities are liberal leaning. Indicators of the study can be political affiliation of surveyed students. Dimensions are what like you can divide liberalism into, such as political ideology or moral beliefs, like we spoke about last week, or even feelings or hot topic issues in government. And then if you like survey the college students, one can just focus on their political ideology and not the other possible dimensions, as they can skew the data, such as I gave the example of maybe like having right-wing students having similar moral beliefs as that of a left-leaning student. So you would just like want to focus on like simply liberal students, not, you know, maybe right-wing students who could have both views leaning in both directions.
Okay, yeah, so good. Yeah, you would want to take a lot of different measures to get the general political climate from a campus. Looks, looking at all kinds of things from their attitudes on particular issues and their party affiliations and things like that. So that would be, and then yeah, you could see how liberal leaning it is based on just where people fall on all those measures. So good. That would be a good overall global assessment of something like that on a college campus. That would be a good way to go about doing it. What other people think about when you're trying to measure something that is social sciencey sounding or something like prejudice? What have other people come up with? Yeah, Jared.
Do you want an answer to number 3 too, or do you just want number 1 right now?
Oh, we did 1 or 3. Yeah, we're just either one of them is.
So when I was looking at 3 and it says like web search prejudice and see what comes up, I mean, it's something that's so prominent in today's society. So I was expecting some things to see. Like when I looked it up, I was obviously seeing police prejudice and racial prejudice just because of everything that happened in 2020 and the things that are continuing in 2021. And then as I start looking down into it, it starts talking about prejudice against LGBTQ rights, because that's also prominent with states like denying their rights and everything. And then I also saw some things about politics, basically saying like prejudice that some politicians may have, and it may pop up and contradict what they say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, so what you're doing there, you're taking kind of the temperature of what is considered prejudice or what is popular when searching for the word prejudice right now, because it could change over time in different places, right? But it definitely is telling you something about the number of hits you get when you punch in a Google search and you're looking for something. But yeah, that would be, I guess you could, you'd be gauging a couple of different things, which would be one, just the popularity of the subject, but also it could be gauging real prejudice. It's just hard to tease those two apart. If people are talking about it a lot, that doesn't necessarily mean a greater prevalence of. It may be greater sensitivity to. Violence is like this. You have a lot more coverage of violence than you've ever had before, but there's not necessarily greater proportion or greater chance of dying in a violent way than ever before. So whenever you do, I guess, web searches or popular media searches, there is that kind of popularity index, and then there's the true prevalence of something going on. And so, yeah, I think some of that would also apply to prejudice. I don't know what other people think about measuring something like prejudice, which we know exists, but we know it varies a lot in the population. We don't know, can't really say we have one silver bullet way of measuring something like this, like they would do in measuring something like that in physics. So we don't really have those kind of equivalent measures in the social sciences, but we try to get something that would say something real about the society around us. What do other people think about measuring stuff? How would we quantify it or operationalize it? Well, just to stick with the one with prejudice, this is one where you would, of course, want to ask people questions that would tap into this concept, but you would have to do it in a tactful way that would not sort of be very hard for people to say yes to this. You would not want to fall into social desirability bias. You're asking people like, well, just how racist are you, or something like that. That would be a bad survey question if you really wanted to get at how prejudicial people might be. You would have to ask questions that get at it, but don't go right through the throat, or exactly, is just right on the nose. You want to ask questions about people working with other people that are different backgrounds than yours, marriage and with one's family, interracial marriage. Some of those questions would be a better way of getting at a topic that's sensitive, because even if people are prejudiced, they will want to give you answers that make them seem less so, because that's just what we call social desirability bias, or example of it. And so when we're measuring things that are dicey, sensitive topics, we want to try to do it in a way that allows people to answer the questions. And so we don't want to make them difficult in the sense that those are so, who is going to admit to some of these questions that ask directly, are you just how racist are you, or a question like that. That would be really a poor way to phrase it. And you would want to go about phrasing questions in a tactful way, lots of different ways of measuring it. And so questions that deal with who you're working with, who is in your family, who would you be friends with, who are you friends with? I mean, all those kind of questions are a little bit more one step removed from asking directly if somebody's racially prejudiced, or if there's some other prejudice that may be creeping into their decision making at work or wherever, that you want to have a good measure of this among your your employee base or wherever, that you would want to use questions that are going to be able to get at the concept you're trying to measure without scaring people or eliciting people's confirmation, social desirability bias that would throw your answers off. So any other comments on this about measuring things, about how we would go about trying to assess something in probably a quantitative way, using questions, some sort of indicators of the popularity of something? You're not using people directly as units of analysis, things from the internet, how often something is talked about in news. All these are types of forms of data that you could then quantify. You could say this is a measure of this. Okay. Well, like I said, we're going to come back to this whole business of measuring things, especially when we're trying to put together scales and indexes, or sometimes typologies of ways you want to get at stuff that is kind of latent, that's not obvious that you're measuring this, but you have a certain number of questions that tap into something we would call depression, for instance. So that's something that we can do with the AdHealth data, as well as other sort of social psyche kind of type variables like that, like self-esteem and how kind of neuroticism, and all kinds of stuff that you could come up with as a measure of individual variability. But we'll do that after we talk a little bit more about sampling, and then we'll talk about experiments today, and then we'll get into the scale stuff in the following week. So let me go back to, we have a few more types of surveys to discuss, I believe. Okay. Not surveys, but sampling. So we were talking about types of probability sampling where the probability of selection is known. There's different ways of going about making sure that you have in your sample a representative sample of the population that you're ultimately interested in describing. So the sample can be stratified. This last one we talked about was clustered. And so you do this in multiple stages to reassure that you have a true random selection of people from within a cluster of other clusters that are selected for some reason related to the representativeness of the population that you're ultimately trying to hit upon. So people based on income and or employment levels, a cluster of them, a cluster based on a lower level of employment, so on and so forth, until you get where you think you are at in terms of being an accurate representative sample of the population. So cluster sampling and stratification sampling are these couple ways that in large, sophisticated random samples of the population, there's a lot of conditions that are put in there. It's not just a big random draw. There's random draws, but within certain parameters to make sure that your random draw is going to result in a representative sample. Well, there is also a lot of what we call non-probability sampling that it's non-probability or non-scientific sampling in the sense that you're not setting up a sampling procedure to try to hit on a representative sample based on known probabilities of being selected, being a part of your sample. These are called, for example, samples of convenience. And so a sample of convenience would be like selecting every 10th lawyer that enters a particular courtroom, just trying to make it seem kind of random, but it's just the lawyers that day or those few days entering into a courtroom, probably not really representative of lawyers generally, or maybe not even lawyers that practice in that area. So yeah, it's just a sample of convenience. You can get them, and that may be good enough for your study, but not exactly representative of lawyers. A call-in or text-in opinion polls on television that could cost you money or may not. That is not going to be representative, most likely, of a broader population's opinion on these things, because people that are willing to pay or bother to even call in or text in something that they see on the radio or television is probably not a random but it's not a representative sampling of how the population feels, because these people probably feel strongly one way or the other on whatever it is, on its a diet plan, or what a celebrity did most recently, or what the president did most recently. People that like to call in, text in, and call into radio shows, all the way up to giving money to weigh in on something. So that is not the average person does that. So that is a problem for inference from going from sample to population. There is also a type of sampling that is more targeted than samples of convenience, and this is purposive or judgmental sampling. So the sample is based on whatever the researcher feels would be most useful for his or her study. So if you are trying to target a particular population, you may want to look at a sample that is going to have some sort of something to say, or have something that is measurable. And so if you want to look at some relationship between school spirit, how good you feel about your school generally, and grades, that you might want to get people randomly at the sporting events at schools, because they will register somewhere on your school spirit chart or scale that you have, so that this is, not everybody's going to be super as pumped as somebody else, but you'll have some variation there. And so if you want to look at the effectiveness also of closed circuit television, those cameras that feed closed circuit televisions for purposes of security, you would probably put them in places where you're going to have a high chance of detecting crime because crime is known to exist. So you want to test their ability to see people doing things in low light behind a car and actually put it in a place where you're likely to get some non-zero hits. Because if you truly randomly select, you may not get a criminal incident going on in the parking lot for a long time. So, so you want to put it in place that is going to give you some hits. If you want to look at also like student outcomes, you might want to base it first on a stratified selection of students' GPA and see if you have consistent variation based on where they're at their GPA with attitudes towards Marywood, for instance. And so you may be purposefully sampling from high ends of the GPA and low ends of the GPA distribution in Marywood students, and then seeing where they turn out, with the assumption that it's going to be a better assessment the higher the GPA of the student usually. So that's a type of sampling where you're sampling to try to get what you expect to get, or you're doing it for a targeted reason to try to get responses that you already can safely assume should be there. You just want to make sure that you're doing it in a way to capture them, to actually observe what you're trying to observe. Okay, so that's another type of non-probability sampling. The other kind of tried and true way of non-scientific or non-probability sampling is just trying to hit quotas. So the sample proportions are supposed to match the population proportions. And so overall, the sample selected for the sample to match population parameters for African Americans in the United States, for example, like 13%. And so you might think, well, that's representative if we have a 13% sample that contains in our sample of so-and-so, how many people with 13% is African American, so therefore we're representative. This accuracy about the knowledge, or accuracy about the knowledge of the population, though, it tends to be not so great using quota sampling, because the populations shift over time, maybe not in their actual proportions, but they're where they live and et cetera. And so to try to get a representative sample of illegal immigrants, percent below the poverty line in a certain age demographic from age 18 to 45, this can all be highly problematic because of changes that can go on in the population that make these quotas no longer mean what they used to mean. And so there's a classic example of quota sampling getting it really wrong and predicting presidential outcome, with the predicted President Dewey defeating Truman. He was supposed to, this was what Gallup predicted, based on quotas set up by the census in the years previous to the presidential election. And so using this tried and true quota sampling, this looked at the likely voters and where they were living, who they would likely be voting for. It looked like Dewey, the Republican, was likely to win. But what happened in the time of the 1940 census is 1948, there were massive changes occurring with people going from rural to more urban areas. And with this shift in the population, that population that was living in the rural area and that would have otherwise voted for Dewey, now living in this urban area, started voting more Democratic, and it shifted districts Democratic, in fact. And so this is problem with using quotas, that the quotas and the population may not represent the population. The sample may not represent the population that you're trying to target with these quotas, because they will change. People have feet and they move, and these quotas cannot be held to be an accurate representation of the people that you're trying to sample. And in fact, with the case with African Americans or other ethnic minorities in the United States, usually you take over samples. You don't just try to take a 13% sample of African Americans. Usually you try to take like double that, because of the distribution of African Americans is not as evenly spread out in the United States. It's more urbanized in some places, especially in the North. And so you have to take in these extra factors into account when you're doing sampling, and you can't rely on just simple population quotas. And if you hit your quota, you think you're going to have an accurate sampling of the population. It doesn't work like that so well. Okay, so anyway, another type of non-probability sampling is you have what's called a snowball sample. And so when you are snowball sampling, you have an initial contact with people that can put you into contact with other people who you are interested in. And so you might have a study that wants to look at the homeless or wants to look at illegal immigrants. And you may have a small number of people that you know that will in turn introduce you to other people that are kind of living at the socioeconomic margins. And so you will have sometimes what you call informants, people who will represent that population and serve as a kind of gateway. And so you have people who introduce you to other people that are in marginalized populations that are probably going to turn up in any large database. And so few examples. Patricia Adler, she did a study of drug dealers in California, and she knew a few drug dealers that were dealing drugs in her apartment right above her. And she met these guys, and over time, she gained their trust, and she went out and did a large qualitative study of drug dealers that were coming from Mexico and going into California and all over the place. And so that was a sample of drug dealers that she was using to kind of snowball from what was just a small 3 or 4 people into a very large sample of drug dealers. You have this Venkatesh is this other guy that did a similar thing with hardcore gangbangers in Chicago, that he knew a few of these guys, and they introduced to all these sorts of street level drug pushers and people that were into illegal weapons and prostitution, all kind, you name it. And so that's clearly a hard population to get at. You're not going to get a random sample of college students. We'll never ever reveal people that are living like a hardcore street lifestyle like that. So you want to get at stuff that is not going to be represented in a large scale probability study. Then you have to do things like this. And these other criminologists, Wright and Decker, they did the same thing with armed robbers. So they had a few people that were being released, they're on probation or parole, and they were talked into introducing them to other armed robbers, and said, this is, we're academics and we're not police. So, and they told them about armed robbery, and they learned a lot from, and they met a bunch of other armed robbers, and that's how they did their study. So the snowballing of initially a small number of people that have special information about people who are in compromising positions, doing illegal stuff, clandestine drugs, drug labs, and smuggling, all kinds of things like that. And then you build from that small sample into a much larger sample. And that's a type of non-probability sampling that is usually reserved for a more specialized population, a population that's usually living at the socioeconomic margins, like illegal immigrants or homeless people, or involved in clandestine criminal activities. Okay, so there is some stuff at the end of this slideshow on measuring variation. I'm going to come back to that later, probably when we start with this on Thursday even, but later on we start talking about indexes and scales and things like that. So let me stop sharing that. Let me talk a little bit about experiments. We'll talk about experiments for a little bit today. I think let's see, what time is it? Yeah, so the chapter 8 in your book talks about the experiment as the sort of classic research design for establishing causation. And so what you have right here, this is the basic model, the basic setup for an experiment. And so you have an initial sample. And so you would have a random sample of college students at Marywood. Okay. And then from that random sample, you have what's called random assignment into an experimental group or a control group. And what the random assignment seeks to accomplish is to equalize differences between individuals in the initial sample between the experimental group and the control group. So that there are going to, of course, be differences between individuals, but the differences through random assignment are thought to be about the same in the experimental group as a control group. So while, yeah, these differences exist, you can't get rid of them. By having an initial sample that's randomly selected and then randomly assign part of that group to an experimental group and part of that group to a control group, those individual differences that may or may not affect the outcomes are about the same on both sides. And so they essentially are a wash. And so it's assumed that they no longer are going to be what is pushing the needle, so to speak, on the outcome side when we are measuring something that we think is going to be different because somebody's in the experimental group versus the control group. Okay. So this is the classic experimental design where you have this initial sample, this random assignment of the initial sample to an experimental group where something happens to this group that does not happen to the control group. So you have either nothing happens or there is placebo that happens. And then you measure the outcome to see if there is any differences, predictable differences between the people that went into the experimental group and the people that went into the control group. Because you are having everything the same, except for the fact that one goes into the experimental group and the other group goes into the control group, it's assumed that if there are any differences, any measurable differences after the fact, that had to be because of exposure to the experimental group. And so that is why the experiment is thought to be the clearest case for showing causation in the sciences, is that you have this random sample, random assignment, and then tightly controlled experimental, then control groups, and then the measurement of the outcome. So in theory, that should do the trick of showing causation. Let's take a look at one example that I have of thinking through an experimental design and apply it to people and something semi-ethical that we could actually do this. And so I have the research question would be, does raising awareness about the health risks of alcohol abuse reduce drinking? And so we sometimes have these public awareness campaigns about don't binge drink, don't do this, don't do that. Does it do any good? Does it really change people's actual behavior? So that would be our research question we would start with. And we would have to then recruit volunteers for the experiment. And so how might we want to do that? How might we want to get people into this experiment in a way that's ethical, would be representative of some population? Somebody volunteer something about how might we go about doing this if we want to, how would we get people into this thing? What do we ultimately want for our experiment to be good, to be valid? Well, we want a representative sample. And so we want to be able to say that we've got a representative sample of some X population. And so, you know, with Marywood, you want a large random sample of the Marywood population. And so with that in mind, you might want to consider, if you want to have it drawn randomly from freshmen, sophomore, juniors, seniors. People who are older probably can drink more, have more access to alcohol. So you might want to do this in a way that it would be kind of purposive, in the sense that you know you're going to get some people who have definitely drunk, because their age would allow that for more for opportunities for that. So you want to recruit volunteers with the goal of getting a representative sample in there. And so you'd want to perhaps do a pre-test here, which in this case, you might want to survey their levels of alcohol consumption. You want to ask them in a survey, you know, how often in the past month do you drink, and give them a large range of options that are mutually exclusive from one another. And so you have someone says, maybe I drank about every day, to people saying that they have never had anything to drink in the past 30 days, and then everybody in between. So you have lots of options there of what you could say in response to that pre-test. And then you would have this random assignment. So you'd have people randomly assigned to an experimental or control group. And the experimental group would be given these videos to watch. Maybe they would be taken to a place to watch the videos, or they would just be told to watch this at home. This is your task. This is what you have to do. Whereas the control group, after they take the initial pretest, nothing happened to them. They're just told thank you for your time. And they're told to go home, and they'll be contacted again later. So with the idea here is that everything happened so far the same with the experimental and control group, except for with the experimental group, they get the video on the health risks of alcohol, where the control group does not. And then we contact them again later. Hopefully we can make contact with most of them. It's a real problem if you can't contact like less than 50% of the people who initially signed up for it. That you want to reassess their alcohol levels of alcohol consumption. And so we want to know, did exposure to that experimental group result in presumably less alcohol consumption as compared to people who were in the control group? So when we talk about this stuff, we remember that we can still use this language of independent and dependent variables. So when you have an experiment, because we're going to use this stuff, independent, dependent variables. We'll use that language again later. When you're in an experiment, what's the independent variable? Anybody know what it would be considered? What is the independent variable in this experiment? It's simpler than what you might be thinking. It's just can I take a guess? It's whether you're in it or not.
Would it be the video being shown?
Yeah, so if it's whether you saw it or you didn't. That's the independent variable. If you're in the experimental group or the control group, that's what the independent variable is. The dependent variable then is what? What are we looking at as sort of the outcome here?
Would it be the level of alcohol consumption?
Yeah, so it would be, technically, you could say it's the change between the level of consumption pre-test and post-test. That's what you're looking at, and you're saying, okay, as the people who saw this video, did they have a bigger reduction in their alcohol consumption than the people who did not see the video? And so that's that would be the independent variable in experiment is just whether or not you're in the experimental group or what level of the experimental group you're in, because you might have different levels of exposure to some stimuli in an experiment. And then the dependent variable is just the outcome. What was the impact of being in the experimental group versus the control group? And so, so that's the independent variables there. Oftentimes, as a safeguard against interfering with the validity of results, researchers doing experiments, will want to do what's called a double-blind experimental design. That means that the subjects don't know that they're in the control group or if they're in the experimental group. So that keeps people from caving into social desirability bias or just being non-cooperative because you're in the different in a group that's different than the group that you thought you wanted to be, whatever. It also it helps with the experimenter not to know. That way, she is less likely to treat those participants differently, even in kind of subtle ways. And so the way that this data is collected is that it's done so that, of course, the subjects aren't told, oh, by the way, you're going to go into the control group or you're in the experimental group. That's not revealed. That's only revealed in the debriefing. That's afterwards. You're told whether or not you're in the control group, you got the placebo, the thing that you got really has no impact on your sleeping. Whereas, okay, you're in the experimental group, you had this heavy dose of CBD stuff, and it was supposed to really make you go to sleep quickly. You don't know that, and the experimenter that's having direct contact with the people, they usually don't know either. So that makes it double blind, and so it protects against the questions to the validity being compromised, and so people don't know if they were in it in the experimental control, and likewise the experimenter doesn't know until after all the data are gathered, and then of course it's revealed. Otherwise you wouldn't know if your experiment worked or not. But it's after all the data is collected, so there's this separation of who's collecting the data and then who's interacting with the subject. So it's a double blind in that sense. These placebo effects, you may have heard that before. A placebo is when you are in a control group, but you are given something sometimes that will mimic the effect or mimic the sensation, the experience of doing something. So with alcohol, there is known placebo effects. If people are given non-alcoholic beverages, sometimes the performance will dip below people who have been given no alcoholic beverage, even though that there's no alcohol in it. With drug trials, this is a really common thing to do because people will sometimes change habits. They will do things differently that might affect whatever they're studying, if it's sleep patterns or whatever it might be. So it's important to make it so that in the experimental group and the control group, things are nearly identical, but for one crucial thing that's different, like an active ingredient, an active drug, so that there can be no doubts that what you're seeing, the outcome, the dependent variable, that how you measure it, really is the result of being exposed to this experimental condition, as opposed to 101 other things that might be impacting the interpretation of your results. Okay, so we'll talk about some of that, some of these confounds to interpreting the results, these just general threats to experimental validity. And so if alcohol is the thing that we're interested in, people's actual drinking habits, then we might not know that there are some people in our study that have a serious history of um, alcohol use. Should be poisoning, not poisoning. But people who have a serious history of alcohol use may have skewed results in an experiment. There is something called a maturation effect where people, if you are relatively scoring high on something like alcohol consumption one week, the next week or next couple of weeks, you might be less so just anyway. And so you might, it's like a mature, you're maturing out of it. That can happen in the study, and you may not be able to account for that with random assignment. There is also something called a testing effect that you can become less sensitive to certain stimulus or treatment because of repeated exposure. And so people may be going through the motions of something that an experimenter is trying to do and really not be as cued into the stimulus as what she used to be because of just repeated exposure to the same experimental conditions. Their instrumentation, so questions, for example, on alcohol may be confusing or inadequate for good measurement of alcohol consumption. So this just comes down to the quality of the language, the questions themselves. Usually questions are written like at a 6th grade reading level, and they need to be really simple. If you want people to be just thinking naturally, not double guessing, not second guessing what they're about ready to respond to in the question. There's also this regression to the mean. It's kind of like maturation, I suppose, in the sense that there is going to be some change in drinking scores regardless. And so if you do happen to have a population that when sampled, you get a pool of them that are just relatively having a lot of drinking going on in the weeks prior to the experiment, that will likely be lower just because of regression to the mean, that eventually, because of whatever was going on to cause some proportion of your sample to be drinking a lot, they will be drinking less later on because whatever was going on is no longer going on. Maybe it's the beginning of the school year or something like that. There's a lot of parties, who knows? But that regression to the mean is something that you see in statistics just generally. And so whenever you observe really high scores or observations that have really high values for some variable X, the next time you observe it, the chances are it will go down a little bit because it's so high. Or if it's super, super low, it's likely to go up just by chance alone. And so that's something about changing means over time, that there's always this tendency to regress, like to go back to the center of the distribution. That's just kind of the luck of the draw, the nature of a random draw of the population. So there's also going to be potential selection bias depending on where you recruit. So people didn't say a whole lot about this, about recruiting. I talked about wanting to have a representative sample, but you could do a large representative sample of people that tend to be close proximity to the bars or close proximity to the library. Now, if you think about that for a second, you probably realize that, yeah, you may get a different drinking history and reactions to the video if you're sampling disproportionately from people around bars versus people around libraries. And so that is a problem that goes to external validity. Is this really true of the population generally? Well, that depends on what you mean by population generally. Yes, people that are hanging around bars a lot, but not so much people who are hanging around libraries. So it starts raising questions on, does this exposure to some video really have any impact, at least in the short term at all? There is also, when you try to recontact people, get back into contact with people, there is mortality, sample mortality, or attrition. People die or sometimes just drop out of your study. And so that's tough if you think that the reason they dropped out is that the very thing that you're interested in measuring. So alcoholics may drop out because of their alcohol use skyrocketing after they saw your video. Who knows? Not to be too morbid about it, but this kind of thing can happen. This was very important criminological research because these people that are into crime live gritty, not healthy lifestyles, and so they tend to die earlier than people who live more conventional lifestyles. And so you have to, in experiments and in longer term studies, you have to be aware of that. If you have a rate of attrition among certain people in your study and you think that that's a problem because I think they're dropping out, I'm interested in studying alcohol, I think it's the alcoholics that are dropping out of my study disproportionately. Well, that's brings up questions of, again, validity. So there's these internal threats to validity, things that might be happening that keep you from measuring, having a good, reliable, valid measure of things inside your study, and then external validity, things that could be going on with, a biased sample that limits your ability to say something informative about the population, limits your ability to make inferences from the sample to the population. Okay, so those are just a few of the ways that validity can be tarnished or hampered somewhat by things going on in the study. Okay, so here are just some general skeletons looking at these overall models of experiments. And so I think we'll talk about this a little bit more next time, but just to cover some of them here briefly, there is something called a post-test only type design, where you have random assignment to an experimental or control group, and then there's some exposure in the experimental group, some stimuli, and then there's some measurement after the fact. There's one in criminology that they had people on parole, and some were randomly assigned to this special work assignment program, others were not. And then they followed them up later on to see how many were, how many reoffended, how many recidivated, were on the records for recidivism. And so then they compared recidivism between the two groups. And yeah, those who were randomly assigned to this work program did indeed have lower rates of recidivism, less crime. And so that's a type of post-test only experiment where you're looking at something that goes on after the fact, after some stimuli is applied to one group and not the other. There's also the pre-test, post-test design. So this is the alcohol experiment that I pitched at the beginning here about people being assessed on their alcohol consumption and they're randomly assigned to a group that gets the stimulus, which is the video, and then the group that does not, and then assessing their alcohol use again in a second time, a post-test, and seeing if there's you're really looking to see if there is a rate of, if the change, if there's a decline, because that would be what would be most informative or suggest that there really was an impact of being exposed to the video in the experimental group being exposed to the stimulus. Okay, so that's another type of experimental design. Then you can get kind of fancy here, over multiple times of measurement. You have time one, there's nothing happening, and then you get a low level of exposure to the stimulus at time 2 and time 3, and then a higher level of exposure to the stimulus at time 3 and time 4. And then you're taking measurements of whatever it is. This is why I think that I had an idea that was taken from traffic studies to look at the exposure of police patrols on, I think, people slowing down at the intersections and coming to a complete rollback stop. Not, kind of boring stuff, but anyway, looking at exposure of police and other cameras and things to see if that could control traffic, and seeing if there's more exposure, if the traffic responded accordingly. That is, more people coming to a complete stop and less speeding, less going through yellow lights, that kind of stuff. And then at the very end, then you take it all away at time 6, and so then there's no extra patrols, and there's no extra cameras at the intersection, and see if behavior goes back to how it was, and see if how long it takes for, if behavior was changing, for it to decay and regress back to the mean after you've taken away all the stimuli. And so that's an interrupted time series with removed treatment, and so you're having the stimuli being increased, and then taken away to see if it returns back to the baseline or not. For just provide further evidence that this is really causing something to happen, causing people's driving habits to change. There are also these what could be called quasi experimental designs, because there's really not true random assignment, but people have done what's called you are matching participants so closely on all the other relevant variables, and then looking to see if something that is different and relevant to the outcome really made a difference over time. And so this is Kathy Whittam. She did this famous study looking at these records of people that were in the child custody, child welfare system, or child protective custody, or child under protective custody by the government. And some of them had records of official child abuse, while others did not, and they were matched on on gender, on their socioeconomic status, their age, and their race. So they were all these kids were the same in every way except for one major way, and that was whether or not they had an official record of child abuse. And they looked then at counts of juvenile or adult arrest later on, and they found that indeed those who experienced this official or had an official record of child abuse were more likely to have a juvenile record and an adult arrest record. So that's a type of quasi-experimental design, in the sense that they're not really, no one's randomly assigned to being abused or not being abused. That's not what's happening. They're just matching them. They can do a really close match on their gender, their socioeconomic status, their age and race, and then the only thing that's different between these groups of kids is whether or not they were abused. And so then you can see if that really played into how criminal they were when they were juveniles and when they were adults. So this is a notion of controlling for or matching people on certain characteristics to see if X matters, if X still makes a difference net of these controls, or after matching people on certain characteristics. We will talk about this a lot more when we get into multiple regression. That is a type of technique where you're not really forming large groups of people that are the same in certain respects. You are statistically taking the data that's available, statistically matching people on these characteristics, and seeing net of these influences, does this variable X still have a significant impact on some outcome? So that's, but this is an example of she's controlling for everything in the sense that she's matching these people on everything, and the only everything that's relevant, the only thing that's different is whether or not they have an official record of child abuse. And then there's another one that's kind of classic. This is just looking at when caller ID started becoming very popular. One of the reasons for it was that it's going to deter crank phone calls and obscene phone calls. And so this criminologist Clark looked at people who volunteered to go into the caller ID and call tracing program, and people who did not, that were on the same service provider. And looked at the level of complaints for obscene phone calls before and after the caller ID call tracing program was in. So this is before everybody had a cell phone. So this was a big deal for people who just had like landlines. You could see who was calling before they called. And so it turned out that, yeah, people were reporting less obscene phone calls for those folks that got the caller ID versus those people who did not have the caller ID over the same period of time. And so it really does look like it wasn't just the popularity of this caller ID, because the people who had it really were more likely to report less obscene phone calls. And so that's another type of experiment, sort of criminological type experiment that is not done in a lab per se. It's kind of more of a quasi-experimental design where you're just looking at people who are very similar in some very important respect, because they're on the same service provider, and just they're doing a survey of obscene phone calls, and they're seeing that, yeah, these people who had the caller ID box did report less, receiving less prank phone calls, less obscene phone calls. Okay. So that's a type of another type of a quasi experimental design. I'm not sure the chapter uses the term quasi, but that's what it is when it's not a traditional controlled random assignment double blind experiment. Usually it's some form of quasi experimental design. Okay, so I think that's it. We'll continue on with some of this stuff on Thursday. There is a question that deals with the stuff on sampling that you can answer. That's not due though until I think the 18th. So you can do that, and we can talk about that one on Thursday. But that is all I have for today. If there's any questions, you can ask me. But that is, I think, all that we're going to do today, folks. So I will see you again on Thursday, and we will see. Should be meeting on campus, but just have to see what the weather does. Okay, so until then, take care. Have a good afternoon, and I'll see you on Thursday. Hi.
Hi. So I was told by the psychology chair, the department guy, I don't know what his name is, but he told me that personality psychology would be good to take. But I don't know if I should do that or if I should take the English class just to get rid of the last requirement I have, or take the data analysis with you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know if they're all given in May, because if I take it in like the summer, it's more money and they don't have a payment plan. So I'm like trying to think about how to do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're worried about paying too much for it, then avoid that, because you're going to have a lot of opportunities to take classes in the fall and the spring. And so you don't really need to load up in the summer unless for some reason you're trying to get out of here in like less than 4 years. You want to take 18 credits though in the fall and the spring, just to
Yeah,
avoid
that's what I
having to take courses in the summer. Then you should be, credit wise, you should be fine getting 120 in 4 years.
If I do the 5-year program, how many credits is that?
It's 30 credits. You start taking your master's credits during your senior year, or you can take them. Sometimes you can take them like the summer before your senior year, and you can take up to 12 credits that will count towards your undergraduate degree and your graduate degree.
Mhm.
So it's a good deal in the sense that you're saving probably at least a year, or maybe a little bit less, and saving some money doing it like that, as opposed to trying to get it somewhere else.
Mhm.
So yeah, you wouldn't be doing graduate courses until probably your senior year, at least is the earliest, maybe the summer before your senior year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would just be taking the internship class over the summer. That would be it then.
Yeah. You can. Yeah. Who are you taking the internship with? Who are you taking it under?
It's Michigan Justice Advocacy.
Okay. But
And
who are
it's
you? Okay. So who are you signing up with that under? Is it with Dr. Rich? Is it with me, or?
I was told by him that it's with you.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, if you sign up under me, like there's, it's like any other class, you sign up under CJ 460 and my name will be there, should be there. If you signed up for, so I don't know if you've done that yet or not, but
When I do with CJ 460, no teachers come up. It just says like no sections available when I put it.
For what summer session?
May, or do I have to do it for June?
Do it for June 2nd, or to June 2nd. Do it for summer 2. Look for it in summer 2 and see if my name comes up.
Okay. Hold on. I have to figure. It took me so long to figure out how to do this. Okay. Summer 1 or summer 2? Sorry, which one?
I'll look for it in summer 2, because it should be there. Because you can sign up for it in summer 2, and then you can start on it before that. Completing 120 hours anyway.
Yeah, because they said they would want me to start in May. That's why I looked at May.
Well, yeah. It may not be.
Yeah, when I did it in summer 2, CJ Criminal Justice Internship, it says no sections available. I don't know if I'm doing it wrong.
Okay. Well,
There's
I'll
there's
have
still-
our secretary put it on there, put it on the schedule for
There's
summer
still-
two.
By the way,
What's that?
we're still recording. By the way, I don't know if you needed to take that off.
Okay.